Right now, let's turn our attention to the biggest announcement from the Tories yet, at their manifesto, which, of course, what a surprise. Get Brexit done is on the front page, but there's also a pledge for 50,000 more nurses, an attack on Jeremy Corbyn and what he called his retrograde socialism. Frankly, big pledges, but nothing in the league of what the Labour Party has pledged. For every £1 being pledged in extra spending by the Conservatives, £28 by the Labour Party. In terms of current expenditure, £3 billion extra spending from the Tories, compared with £83.9 billion from the Labour Party. So does anyone's sums add up? Well, let's talk to the man. He'll know. He's the director of the Institute for Fiscal Studies, Paul Johnson. Good morning to you.
Good morning.
Good morning. Well, you've been analysing all of the manifestos for us and letting us know where the numbers add up. There's no doubt at all that the numbers in the Tory manifesto are real sort of small fry, aren't they, compared with what we've been seeing from Labour manifesto and indeed actually from the Liberal Democrats as well.
Yeah, they're tiny. There's very little in terms of tax and spending. There's very little in the Conservative manifesto. Now, to be fair, the Chancellor did announce in September some fairly big spending increases for next year, and indeed for the next 2 or 3 years, for schools and the NHS. So in a way, they've taken their own excitement away from the manifesto by announcing it. So if you take those into account, then there are some reasonably significant spending increases over the next year or two, but almost nothing additional in the manifesto, which means that over the next few years, whilst we get that one-off increase in health and schools, for most bits of the public sector, it's sort of steady as she goes. And that does mean, of course, that the cuts of the last decade or so, according to this manifesto at least, look like they're pretty much baked in.
Well, indeed. I mean, we had all these years of austerity, and one of the accusations and criticisms from the Labour Party and others is that austerity was a political choice rather than a necessity. Tories have always said it was a necessity, but apparently no longer a necessity. But even after these pledges from the Conservative Party, after another, say, 5-year term, would we have got rid of austerity altogether? Would we be back ahead of where we were in 2010, or would we still be sort of treading water?
Well, it depends on which bits of public spending we're looking at. So health spending, for example, is already way ahead of where it was in 2010. I mean, there are genuinely big increases in health spending, though, of course, the demand for it rises at least as fast. But if you look outside of health, if you look at local government, particularly social care, justice, those sorts of things, then spending, on this set of proposals, even by the end of the next Parliament, would still be below where it was in 2010. So whilst we've turned a corner in the sense that we're no longer, or the government or the Conservatives are no longer looking to cut things, and in some areas they're increasing spending, in plenty of areas they're certainly not undoing the cuts of the last decade.
And in one of the big areas, perhaps, which really, we've got decades now of political parties and governments of all political hues absolutely refusing to take this on, but social care, that was the big problem in the 2017 Tory manifesto, dubbed the dementia tax on people in old age needing care in care homes, which cost them tens of thousands of pounds a year. A rather vague promise to do something about it in the next 5 years with political consensus, but no actual commitment to anything specific and no actual spending commitment, crucially. That otherwise perhaps would have been a big spending commitment.
Yes, it's all a bit feeble and rather disappointing, I'm afraid. I mean, the government for the last 2.5 years has kept on promising that they would come up with proposals, and they've completely failed to do that. Though, to be fair, governments for the last 20 years have failed to do that. Boris Johnson, the very first speech he gave as Prime Minister, said, made a promise that he would sort social care. And as you say, there is essentially nothing in the manifesto other than to say, yet again, we'll sort social care by getting some kind of consensus, but no detail of any kind whatever.
No, indeed. Well, look, I mean, there are promises, things like to recruit 50,000 more nurses, but that's through spending just an extra £879 million a year on recruitment, retention and training. Rather crucially there, as 18,500 of those nurses aren't new nurses. They're just nurses who would otherwise leave the profession, but instead they're going to try and retain them with pay or other changes in their conditions of work. So those numbers, perhaps rather smaller than people looked at. Crucially, one of the big issues in the last week week, especially after Labour's announcements and their massive big spending pledges, huge amounts of it, there's 83.9 billion on current expenditure, not on building things, not on investment. They were talking about how they were going to be funding that by just raising taxes on the top 5% and on corporations and businesses. And we discussed that with you last week. Big question marks, and it was noticeable in the question time and other opportunities where the public had a chance to question Jeremy Corbyn. People seem to be a little bit unconvinced that actually that 5% of the population is going to be enough to pay for all of that spending. But the Tory party, they've introduced what they call their triple lock. Now, we've had the commitments on pensions and how much they will rise by, but this is a triple lock on tax. So no increase in income tax, no increase in national insurance, and no increase on VAT, no increase in the rates of any of those over the coming Parliament. But I know in your analysis, you've looked at this so far. There is still likely to have to be some sort of increase in tax receipts to pay for this extra spending. So where is that money likely to come from?
Well, over the next, if you just take at face value what's in the manifesto, then that's not going to require much in the way of tax rises. But I think what we've seen over the last 2.5 years is that the Conservatives spent way more than they put in their 2017 manifesto. It's one of these oddities where, you promise the electorate actually very little and then massively over-deliver in terms of...
How unusual.
In terms of spending. Well, exactly. Certainly if we see anything like that, and the Conservatives want to keep to their promise of a current budget balance, and that's why they've got so little spending in here, is because they want to keep to this current budget balance rule, then we'll certainly need some more tax rises. And if you're looking, just a little bit further out, we will be spending more on pensions and more on health, and at some point, presumably more on social care, as the population ages, as the cost of health rises. At some point, we will have to raise taxes in one way or another. Now, actually, if you look over the last decade, and the tax burden has very gradually crept up, and there are all sorts of ways you can do that, of course. You can do it on companies, you can do it with, as we've done, with big cuts in the value of pension tax relief, which has actually been worth quite a lot of money, changes to rules around national insurance contributions and so on. So there are all sorts of ways in which you can raise taxes without raising those main rates.
And the fiscal drag, of course, that people that have to earn an awful lot less in real terms to move into a higher tax band now.
Although tax bands actually for most people over the last few years have been going up, probably if anything a bit faster than earnings, but it's certainly one possibility that we'll see that stop. And it is a relatively easy and painless way for governments to raise a bit more money.
OK, just finally, Labour's pledge over the weekend of another £58 billion commitment for the pensions payout for the women who've been hit by the pension rises in age. The WASPy women against state pension inequality. They're looking at getting payouts of an average of £15,000 in compensation for having seen their pension age rise from the age of 60 effectively to 66, they say, without being told in advance, without getting full information about that. It's a tax, it's a pledge that wasn't even in the manifesto. The cost is, astronomical, isn't it? £58 billion. Is there any way that has been costed at all? Is there any room for manoeuvre there?
No. The Labour manifesto itself had, on the current side, £80 billion of increases in spending and supposedly £80 billion of tax rises, and this is another, £12 billion a year of spending on top. There doesn't seem, the extraordinary thing is that one sort of almost afterthought was way bigger than the entire Conservative manifesto in terms of spending. It seems that there's almost no limit to the ambition of what Labour feel that they can pay for. So I think two things about this. One, it immediately, 2 days later, breaks the fiscal rules that they set out in their manifesto. And it's also, to the extent that there are any priorities within there, it is interesting that they finding all of that money for this group, actually, most of whom are, some of whom have clearly had a difficult time of it, but most of whom are relatively well off. But they haven't actually found money to, for example, compensate the much poorer group of working age people who, without any notice at all, haven't seen their benefits rise over the last 4 years in line with inflation.
Paul Johnson, always a pleasure to speak to you, sir, to get some, I suppose, some neutral analysis of what is really going on to help us all make sense of it all. Paul Johnson, Director of the Institute for Fiscal Studies. Appreciate that. Let's talk to Claire Fox now. She's an MEP for the Brexit Party and joins us now. Good morning to you.
Good morning.
Good morning. Well, we had not only the Tory manifesto launched, the last of the launches yesterday. We had the Brexit Party launch on Friday. You launched a contract with the British people rather than a manifesto. Why was that?
Well, partly the reasons that you've just explained, that when manifestos come out, people treat them with a certain amount of cynicism, and I suppose it was an attempt to say manifestos aren't worth the paper they're written on too often, they're full of empty promises. So it was an attempt at saying these are the things that we think are priorities, and these are some, you've just made the point about nurses. So one of the things that we suggested was that, for example, you'd get rid of the need for a degree for nurses, which seems like a very practical thing, but actually was something that has come out when we've talked to lots of people on the ground, which I think would make a huge difference. Or, everybody wants to throw money at things, whereas actually our proposal was we get rid of the 50% target for going to university, and we concentrate more on things like apprenticeships. So, it's just a very different feel to it, that's all.
Well, indeed, you've talked about key policies in your manifesto about like a political revolution, reforming the voting system, abolishing the House of Lords, overhauling the postal voting system as well, and some other sort of bigger picture issues. Is it really relevant to the Brexit Party though to have a specific manifesto? Not only is it your Brexit Party does what it says on the tin, it's about delivering Brexit, but also, and in terms of your appeal to voters, that's what it's about. Also, has it been a bit of a problem? Because, of course, you very much come from the left, Claire, and yet there are many very much coming from the right in your party as well. Quite difficult to actually come up with a range of policies on economic and social issues, which can actually get agreement from all of the party, isn't it?
No, actually, that hasn't been an issue at all, because actually there's loads of policies in the contracts. It's just that, on the one hand, it's also if you're going to have a political revolution and say you're going to be honest to voters, you don't want to pretend that the Brexit Party are going to be running the government and say this is what we're going to do. So these are the kind of issues that we think are important in a post-Brexit Britain. So the main focus is undoubtedly the political revolution side of it, the need for, after the 3.5 years of watching the shenanigans in terms of Parliament and not delivering the vote, that slogan, which is just a slogan, change politics for good, has had a real resonance with voters. And that's the thing which most people talk about all the time. The way that the House of Lords tried to block a democratic vote, the problems of things like postal voting that have been kind of shown up to be something that was meant and intended, obviously, for the infirm or people who couldn't vote, suddenly becoming a kind of easy way for parties to try and get an easy vote out and therefore open to corruption. And those kind of issues, I think, are important to lay down as markers for what kind of a new Britain you want. Because, one of the things that drives me mad about the Labour Party manifesto, just to use that as an example, is it's like this massive radical change, apparently on paper. I mean, so much of it is kind of old-fashioned 70s stuff, but nonetheless, promising everything for everyone. Well, if you haven't got the courage to implement the most radical change that we've seen voted for by the public ever, which was the Brexit vote, certainly in recent history, and they say, oh no, that's far too going to shake up the status quo far too much, we're not going to deliver on it, then how on earth can you believe their manifesto?
Okay, but let's talk about the appeal of your party though, because we are looking at you ever since the pledge to stand down candidates in more than half the seats, including all of the Tory held seats from 2017, a number of big Labour Leave seats. The reality is you're now down to 5% in the polls. Could manage to maybe just scrape a few MEPs, but certainly probably not holding the balance of power at the event of a general election going as the polls suggest at the current time. Of course, I think it'd be a brave soul to predict the outcome given polling in recent years at this time ahead of general election date. But going from being a party that won the European elections to being a party down at 5%, If Boris Johnson does win the majority he says he wants to get, and he does deliver Brexit, gets that vote before Christmas, we leave on January the 31st, and if there is no extension from December 2020, will that be a job well done? And will you, I mean, you're an MEP, obviously you cease to have your role as an MEP on January the 31st on this plan. Will the Brexit Party disband, or will the Brexit Party continue? Because there's some talk about it be rebranding as the Reform Party. Would you want to continue in a new party rebranded?
Well, I think that there's definitely an appetite for a new party. That's the problem with this election, and it is a genuinely agonising problem, is there's no doubt about it, the Brexit Party's been massively squeezed and traumatised, both by the voting system, but also because I think, understandably, the electorate are exhausted. They're terrified of the Remain alliance taking over Parliament again and a continual blocking of that 2016 vote. So I think that millions of voters are going to loan their votes to other parties that there's not really any enthusiasm for. You know, I keep hearing from people that lots of people will vote Tory. I then hear, one of the, ministers, Matt Hancock, yesterday saying everybody loves Boris, the Tories are going to romp home. And if they get complacent like that and think that this is an actively supportive vote for the Conservative Party in general, they're wrong. This is a Brexit election in that sense. It's shaken up attachments of all the political parties. There's been massive rows in the Brexit Party. You've seen it in public. Lots of people, everyone you talk to has got a different theory as to what you could have done. Stand everywhere, stand down more, was the right decision made? But that was a recognition of the very extraordinary circumstances in which we go into this general election. Now, I don't think that the withdrawal agreement that Boris has negotiated is sufficiently different from May's withdrawal agreement to get overly excited about. But there's a recognition as well that it's marginally better, and if there's pressure maintained on the Tory party, because that's the only reason they've got to the point they are in now, then that would be a way of ensuring that Brexit isn't lost. And that's been an important reason why so many voters are going to vote for the Tories.
Just finally, very, very briefly, if you will, Claire Fox, do you trust that Boris Johnson is going to deliver Brexit?
Not entirely. I think he will deliver a form of Brexit, though, and I think now the great thing about the rhetoric is whether they've been forced externally, they've actually promised Brexit is not going to be evaded. A form of Brexit that I'm not happy with, but it will be a technical form of Brexit at least.
Former Conservative Party Chairman Lord Eric Pickles. Good morning to you.
Good morning, and Arch. I'm also a very moderate person.
Everyone's claiming to be moderate these days, but there we are. I say, if Andre's claiming to be moderate, then goodness knows what's happening to this country, Eric. All right, look, let's talk about this big launch yesterday. I say big launch, manifesto launch, big speech from Boris Johnson, your party leader, welcomed by one of your successors as Tory party chair, James Cleverly. But there wasn't actually very much in the manifesto, other than get Brexit done, which adorned the front page. Unleash Britain's potential is the catchphrase, the slogan of this election campaign. There wasn't really very much in it. Have you, after 9 years in power, run out of ideas?
Well, 69 pages worth of it. I mean, there were detailed policies and lots of things, but there were basically, I think, three big offers. One was to get Brexit done, which is amazingly important. Two was to ensure that the tax is not going to go up on income tax, value-added tax, or national insurance. And the third one was a massive injection into the National Health Service. And I think Boris is unique. Boris is a Tory leader who is going to fight on the NHS and win on the NHS.
Well, it's interesting that actually some polling has suggested that people do trust Boris Johnson marginally, very marginally, more than they do Jeremy Corbyn on the NHS. And that's always been a little bit of a problem in terms of trust on the NHS for the Conservative Party previously. But there's so much focus on Brexit. You're now, the only major party that is about getting Brexit done, other than the Brexit Party themselves, down to just 5% in the polls as a result of that. But in terms of competing with Labour Party pledges, we know that 100 billion in terms of investment expenditure from the Tories, and a lot more than that from the Labour Party in terms of infrastructure investment. In terms of current expenditure, Labour are promising more than £83 billion. The Tory Party promising just £3 billion. Now, although you can argue that this is about being careful with the books, it's going to be difficult if people are saying that, yeah, they want austerity to be over, it's time to actually start spending. How can you compete with the Labour Party when you're only pledging a tiny, tiny drop in the ocean in compared to the amount of funding that they want to put into all of our public services?
Well, I think you can kind of understand why Mr. Blair and Mr. Brown kept the likes of Mr. Corbyn and Mr. MacDonald out of office and on the backbenches for all those years. You can kind of understand why he kept the extremists out of the Labour Party. I mean, the prospect of spending £28 for every pound that the Conservative Party spends, I mean, it's just basically not achievable without massive taxation. It's not achievable without diving our country into recession. So they're making promises they know they can't deliver. They say they were going to deliver a fully costed budget, and then suddenly they're able to spend £58 billion on that wasn't in their manifesto. So, I mean, I think there is a big difference between ourselves and the Labour Party, and that was one of credibility.
You talk about credibility, and certainly the claims, the 58 billion pledge for the WASPy women, given that it wasn't even mentioned in the manifesto, has raised quite a few eyebrows for people. But this is very much being seen as a safety first manifesto after what went horribly wrong with the 2017 manifesto pledge, and that was particularly over the issue of the so-called, it was dubbed very soon, the dementia tax. Indeed, I heard some Tory MPs dubbing it the dementia tax. And yet, one of the biggest issues facing this country is barely even tackled in your manifesto: social care. A promise yet again. Boris Johnson said when he got into leadership that he would deal with this, and pledges from previous Tory governments and other parties as well. Everyone says they're going to deal with social care. No specific pledges, no specific amount of money to tackle that issue, but a promise that some sort of vague promise about working with other parties, cross-party consensus to do something about this. But the reality is, we know what the options are. It's time to actually do it. Why running so scared? I understand the need to sort of feel that you need to play safe after what happened in 2017, but does the Conservative Party have the courage of its convictions to just get the job done?
I mean, there is a strong need to get consensus on this because we're talking about something for a long term. And what I think people don't kind of understand is you'll be actually expecting the public to pay out for something that most of them will almost certainly not use. So, it needs to be a combination of what the state can do, what private insurance can do, and you need consensus for that because you need to be able to make a commitment for 30 or 40 years in advance, and that's why it's been necessary. And I have to say, being kicked around by political football between the various parties over the years has not helped.
And can we talk about the NHS? You talked about this big cash injection to the NHS, and we've been speaking to Paul Johnson from the Institute for Fiscal Studies earlier in an article he's written today, pointing out that there's not that much extra money announced in this manifesto, but that just comes on top of recent budget with a huge cash injection. But one of the big pledges is 50,000 more nurses. But 18,500 of those new nurses aren't new nurses at all. They're the nurses who are already working in the NHS. This is about retaining them. Is that the sort of pledge, though, that will make a lot of voters say, they're not being given the full story?
Yeah, but the reason we know that is because it's been quite clear that what we're talking about is career development of those nurses, about a proper working atmosphere for those nurses. I think it's important to retain nurses and to develop nurses' training and to develop their career potential. And actually, I don't see anything wrong with that. To be able to ensure that people who otherwise would believe in the profession will stay in the profession seems to me to be a very sensible thing for the government to do.
Let's talk about how we pay for the spending pledges that you have put forward. You've announced a triple lock as well. So income tax, national insurance and VAT, none of the rates of those will rise over the coming Parliament. However, independent, neutral number crunchers have said even with your minimal spending compared with what Labour are promising, it doesn't add up without some sort of tax rises. So where are you going to get the money from?
Well, I was listening to some analysis coming down, and they're clearly going to increase borrowing by a small amount. It's within the headroom that the last Chancellor left. I don't think, as somebody who is very keen on controlling public expenditure, I'm not worried.
You're convinced that there won't be major tax rises. What about those sort of stealth taxes we've heard so much about over the years? Tories used to always criticise the Labour Party for that. That everyone says, well, the headline figures don't go up, but actually, in terms of the pound in your pocket and how much is taken by the state, it does end up creeping up.
Well, that sounds like Labour to me. I mean, the most obvious stealth tax, the favourite stealth tax of all governments has been national insurance, and Boris has said no, they're not going to increase national insurance or VAT or income tax.
Are you convinced this is a winning manifesto? The polls suggest, you're certainly creeping up gradually, and that there hasn't been a big bounce for the Labour Party, 2%, 3 percentage points at most. And certainly by this stage of the election campaign, they were already seeing that bounce after manifestos were published. Are you convinced this is a winning manifesto for the British people?
Am I convinced that the Conservative Party is going to win this election? No, I'm not. Because Mr Corbyn can win, and not by getting an overall majority, but by getting into coalition with the Scott Nats and with the Lib Dems. So it is stacked against the Conservative Party. I mean, what we are looking for, I heard someone talking earlier about, we're looking for people to lend their votes to keep this brand of socialism out.
Let's talk to Lord Charlie Falconer. He's a former Labour Justice Secretary who joins us now. Good morning to you.
Good morning, Julia.
Good morning. Well, look, we've had all the manifestos launched. We've just been talking to the Conservatives, Eric Pickles, about their big announcements on Sunday. We have not seen, after that Labour manifesto, we're pledging just billions and billions of pounds, not just in investment spending, but also in current spending, 5% pay rise for every public sector worker, billions more for the NHS, for schools, for pretty much everybody and everything, free broadband, lots of giveaways. We haven't seen a big bounce in the polls. I think 2-3 percentage points at most. Are you worried?
Yes, I am. I mean, I think what's happening is that a big choice is now being ranged before the public. And you're absolutely right to say that Labour are offering billions and billions more of expenditure to try to deal with all the problems in, for example, public services. And I mean, my impression I got from the manifesto from the Conservatives yesterday is that we're not really going to offer you anything. I'm not saying they won't do certain things, but they don't dare say very much. And the things that they are saying sort of carry with them the problem of broken promises. So there is a sort of choice now, isn't there? And I am worried that the polls aren't moving. I hope that the polls do move, because I think, what are we going to do about public services? What are we going to do about Europe? And what are we going to do about the union within the UK are the big questions facing Britain.
Well, this is the interesting thing, isn't it? Because the polling for Jeremy Corbyn is incredibly poor. He's the least popular party leader of any party. I mean, worse than even the Michael Foot, accused of writing his manifesto in 1983 for the Labour Party as the longest suicide note in history. Yours is a pretty lengthy document, and people are saying that it may be viewed in the same way in a matter of weeks' times. What I'm intrigued by is with so many giveaways and so much of the amount of funding being questioned by independent people like the Institute for Fiscal Studies, who are clearly trusted by Labour because they're mentioned half a dozen or more times as cited as for facts and figures in the Labour manifesto grey book, the costings book. That people they like a lot of the policies, but they don't think your numbers add up, and they don't trust your leader. Isn't that the problem?
I mean, I think in relation to both leaders, there is indications from the polls that the public are very uncertain about them. I think, for example, in relation to Jeremy, that the polls are getting a bit better for him, but I agree the polls are bad about him. As far as Boris Johnson is concerned, there's a real question mark over his honesty. You can't believe a word that he says, and that is not a good place for the Prime Minister to be. But I do believe very strongly that this is a pretty significant election because it does involve a quite significant choice for the public. I do think the Conservatives would not invest as much in public services. It may be that they would be able to hold their tax promises, but the tax promises are very unreliable, but they will certainly not make the investment. Labour will. It might well be that there will be tax rises beyond those that have been identified that you have to employ to pay for them. But there is a real choice there.
But you say there might well be. I mean, you know there will be. When the Labour Party, when John McDonnell, Shadow Chancellor, and Jeremy Corbyn, the leader, say that the only tax that will go will be on business and corporations, on the billionaires, and on the top 5%, you know as well as I do, every neutral commentator, anyone who can do the maths, knows that that is not going to cover the sort of spending commitments that Labour has made.
The figures in the Grey Book show that it could be done on that basis. I think the reality is that one never knows what's going to happen with the economy over 5 years.
No, even if the economy did really well over the next 5 years, independent examiners have said there's no way it can deliver.
The analysis, the attacks are based upon the fact that the assumptions about the economy may be too optimistic. So I don't think you're right to say that, but I recognise the reality, which is that what will happen over the next 5 years in relation to the economy is almost impossible to predict.
Okay,
this is such a key moment, I think, in relation to political choice that the public have got to make. And really, my impression of the Conservative manifesto is if they could have got away with no manifesto at all, they would have done so, because nobody trusts Boris Johnson, and he doesn't want to end up sort of impaled on his manifesto in the way that Mrs May was.
Well, exactly. It was definitely a safety-first manifesto, no question at all.
It was more significant than that, Julia. I think what happened there in that manifesto, for example, and you've read a lot about this, he promised he'd deliver something, a plan on social care. He didn't produce it. I don't know, not many people have focused on his justice proposals, but I don't know if you've noticed, but what he's saying on the criminal justice system, which everybody says is in a bit of a mess, is a royal commission.
Yes.
Which is extraordinary, which is an absolute... I'm not saying anything about it, and indeed I won't do anything about it for years, because a Royal Commission, in my experience, is a kick the can down the road.
Well, again, we've seen that from all major political parties. Obviously, we've been tackling Lord Pickles on a number of those allegations and those claims. And like, let's also talk about there may be an accusation, and a lot of people will consider it to be true, that the Tory party aren't offering enough after years of austerity. Even some of their pledges about doctors and about GPs and police officers just take us back to where we started in 2010. However, there is also the accusation against the Labour Party, and many people are saying that actually you're just spending far too much and far too much of other people's money. When you look at not just what was in the manifesto, but the just casual reference of another £58 billion being spent on pension payouts to women, the WASPs, the Women Against State Pension Inequality. 3.7 million women basically born in the 1950s who thought they'd retire at 60, but they've seen their state pension age rise, and lots of them weren't informed about it. Lots been left out of pocket. There's been talk in quite a few circles cross-party for some sort of compensation, but we're looking at an average payout of £15,000 to 3.7 million women. Where has that £58 billion come from?
Well, it's going to have to come, is it not? All of these expenditure promises that you're talking about have to come from a combination of tax and borrowing. And you're right to identify that the absolutely clear choice that is being made in this election is between I think the Conservatives, I may have got the figures wrong, but it's something well under 10 billion extra expenditure that the Tories are proposing, and it's up to 80 billion more expenditure that Labour are offering. And there's a clear choice for the country, is there not? You can continue with your broken public services, but your taxes may not go up as much, or you can make an effort to improve those public services, but it's going to cost people more in taxation.
But wait a minute. But that's not what the Labour Party is saying. They're saying it's going to cost those people, those rich people over there, not you. 95% of people are being told you can have all this extra spending, you can have your 5% pay rise from the public sector, we can help these women being hit by the pensions, we can help everybody, and we won't have to pay because we're not in the top 5%. That's very different from saying more public service spending and more taxes. That's not what people are being told.
Well, they're being told that anybody over £80,000 is going to pay more tax.
So very high earners.
It's also saying that corporation tax is going up, and that increase in corporation tax will inevitably be reflected in other increases.
So are you saying that what we're being told by Jeremy Corbyn and John McDonnell is actually a complete lie, that our taxes we will have less money in our pockets as a result of this extra spending on public sector?
I'm not saying that. I'm saying that they've costed it on the basis of the 80,000 and above and corporation tax. And
but they didn't cost the 58 billion.
Well,
58 billion, not 58 million, 58 billion pounds.
No, I know. It's big money, and precisely where the taxation will fall has been identified. It may be as time goes on, it will fall elsewhere. But the choice is clear, isn't it? I don't know. They've costed it. It shows it can be done. It depends upon.
The fact that every single independent commentator has said that the numbers simply don't add up.
They're not saying
they
that.
are.
No, they're not. What they're saying
which independent commentator is saying the numbers do add up?
Take Paul Johnson. He's saying
from the IFS,
man. He's saying basically it's extremely unlikely that one could do it on the basis of the estimates made in relation to the 80,000 and the corporation tax. That he is saying it is very, very likely that the taxes will be spread over wider people because of what's likely to happen to the economy. But we're in a sort of I'm not disputing with you, Julia, that higher taxes will be required. I don't know precisely where. I see what Labour says in relation to it. It could be done, but it depends on the economy.
Just finally,
be realistic about the choice. The big choice is more tax, better public services. Tories not making any promises. Please don't ask us anything.
Okay. And just finally, before we go to a news update, the SNP have said for the price of putting you guys into power of some sort of not just a formal coalition, but actually providing the votes for Jeremy Corbyn in the event of a hung parliament, would be at the second independence referendum for Scotland in 2020, and indeed the scrapping of Trident. Would those be a price worth paying to put a Labour government back into power?
We should say no to both of them. And I mean, it's just inconceivable that we could possibly trade our way into power on the basis of either of those promises. And if they said we'd back the Tories instead, then I'd say to them, back the Tories then, because it's an outrageously ridiculous pair of demands that they're making.
Let's get to the Liberal Democrats. Christine Jardine is Lib Dem spokeswoman on Home Affairs. Good morning to you, Christine.
Good morning, Julia.
Lovely to speak to you. Now, of course, with lots of focus on Labour at the end of last week, lots of focus on the Tories, their manifesto. It's all over the front pages today. But it's interesting that Chuka Umunna, your Foreign Affairs spokesman, is speaking today, during a speech in Watford ahead of the NATO Leaders Conference coming up very, very soon. Of course, when Donald Trump, everyone's favourite person, is coming to this UK, saying we've got 17 days to stop the UK becoming Trump's poodle. Is that really what this election's about?
It's one of the things this election's about. This election's about a lot of things. It's never as simple as one issue, I don't think. The NHS, we're wanting to invest in bringing healthcare up to scratch, particularly mental health care, bringing it in line with physical health care. Climate change, I think, is the biggest single issue. But what Chuka is talking about today is the fact that we would spend more on defence because we would commit 2% of GDP to our defence, which is in line with what NATO wants. And that would be bigger than the Conservative figure, because if we stay in the European Union, the Institute of Fiscal Studies says that the economy will grow more if we're in the European Union, so we'll have more money. We still won't be able to afford the ridiculous things that Labour are suggesting. I mean, they all sound like great policies and great things to do, but they're impossible. Well, some of them sound like great things to do, but they're impossible to achieve. Take, for instance, the free broadband for everybody. How are they going to do that?
Well, you say that ridiculous pledges are impossible to achieve, and yet your party launched its manifesto and its party campaign, election campaign, saying that Jo Swinson is going to be the Prime Minister of this country. And even she and your other party leading figures have admitted that actually, look, on the polling right now, there hasn't been a Lib Dem bounce. There hasn't been a massive support for Jo Swinson as your leader, and actually you are looking at just propping up a coalition government. So isn't everyone making fairly ridiculous pledges?
We won't be propping up any coalition government. We won't be putting either Jeremy Corbyn or Boris Johnson into number 10. And if you look at the opinion poll, that's the latest opinion poll that's come out since the debates, Jo Swinson's actually, the Liberal Democrat rating has gone up. Jo Swinson is actually, she's cutting through with people who are so fed up with this tired old politics that's leaving so many people working hard just to get by and feeling that they're left behind. We need change. And that is what Jo represents.
But you're on 15% in the polls. It's far less than you were on in the European elections. Very different kind of elections, of course. But realistically, we are not seeing that big change. We are seeing a coalescing of votes back to the two major parties, the Tories and the Labour Party. You're not hitting the point where you're actually going to be able to translate that into extra seats. There's some predictions you could actually end up with fewer seats at the end of the day.
We are actually. There are a lot of seats up and down the country where the Liberal Democrats are the only ones challenging, because Remain voters recognise that we are the lead party of Remain, and only by voting for us can they stop Boris Johnson and his ridiculous Brexit plan, which this pledge about getting Brexit done. Brexit will not be done with his withdrawal agreement. We still have a decade of talks, and the only way to stop Brexit is to stop it. Now, there are Remain voters up and down the country in marginal constituencies and other constituencies voting for us against the Conservatives. And, often that doesn't show up in the national polls.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Everyone's saying, yes, each constituency is going to be its own mini battleground, isn't it? Just finally, though, you say, you're the main Remain party. Was it a mistake to say you wanted unilaterally to revoke Article 50 rather than have a second referendum to lead to a Remain vote? Because a lot of people who are staunch Remainers feel that is such an affront to democracy. I think a lot of people would say a second referendum is an affront to democracy when you haven't implemented the first one. But to actually say we won't even bother having another referendum, we'll just basically pretend that vote didn't happen and ignore it. Do you think that was a mistake?
That's not actually an accurate... I know it's a representation that's been put about, but it isn't an accurate representation. What we've always said is that our first preference is for the deal, when and if there eventually is one, to go back to the people in a...
No, that's not true, Christine. If you haven't got a majority, you want a second referendum. If you get a majority, you want to revoke Article 50. That's in your manifesto.
For us to win a majority in the general election after 100 years would be a seismic change in British politics, the likes of which people would be voting for us in the numbers, which would mean that we would have a majority for leaving the European Union. Now, you've just said that you don't think that's going to happen. And if that is not the case, then what we will be saying is that we are with our original policy, which we were the ones to keep up with. It was Tim Farron who said that this deal, if there is one, should be ratified by the British people because it's enormous change. And we need to be absolutely sure that it's what people want.
Okay, Christine, it is nevertheless the case that your first pledge, if you were in a majority government, would be to revoke Article 50 and not have a second referendum to ratify anything. Right now, let's talk to Tommy Sheppard. He's from the SNP and joins us now. Good morning to you, Tommy.
Good morning,
Good
Julia.
morning. Well, big developments over the weekend, certainly with the interviews with your party leader, Nicola Sturgeon, what she had to say at that Question Time event on Friday night. Basically saying, look, the price of doing business with the SNP after the general election, if we're in a hung parliament, will be not only a second independence referendum for Scotland in 2020, not perhaps in the second half of a parliamentary term, but also scrapping Trident. Do you think that those are pledges, those are demands that either Jeremy Corbyn or any other party could agree to?
Well, our position is that if the electorate deal us the political cards and we're in a position to be part of forming an alternative administration, then we will do so. We will work hard with other opposition parties to lock the Conservatives out of government and form a progressive alternative. But no one should take us for granted, really. And what we're doing now is setting out the promises in which we are seeking to be elected. And if we are elected by the people who are voting for us, then I think we're duty bound to try and pursue those promises when we get round to any such negotiations. So we're just trying to make it clear what the character of our party and our programme is, so that people can be under no doubt after the election if that's the game we get into.
Well, Nicola Sturgeon very early on said, don't bother picking up the phone to me unless you're willing to offer that second independence referendum. Jeremy Corbyn on Friday night at the Question Time special was talking about how it wasn't a priority. It wasn't a priority in the early years, and when pushed by Fiona Bruce, said, the first year, 2020, 2021, 2022 would be the earliest. Nicola Sturgeon made clear, look, that he would be willing to move when it came to the fact that he couldn't form a government, or he could, based on that he'd be quite happy to bring it forward. Is that a hill you'll die on, though? It's got to be in 2020 and no, not even in 2021 in January. Why does it have to be in 2020?
Well, I think in fairness, I understand Jeremy Corbyn's position, and I'm sure it's genuine. But of course, that position only holds if Jeremy Corbyn is the leader of a majority government. If he is not, then he's going to have to compromise that position by talking to other people who might take a different point of view. And if we're one of those parties, then we're making it quite clear that we don't even get into the room, we don't even get to the table unless we can agree on a principle, which is not that there should be another Scottish referendum, by the way, but the principle is that when and whether there is another referendum should be a matter for the people of Scotland and not for anyone else. If we can agree in that principle and respect the decisions of the elected Scottish Parliament, then it's entirely possible to have a very constructive discussion about a whole range of other things. But we don't get into the room in the first place unless we can agree on that principle.
And just finally, and very briefly, if you would, Tommy Sheppard, your leaders talked a lot about a progressive alliance and how she would never put a Tory government into power. In the last 60 years, the Scottish people haven't voted for there to be a Tory government in Westminster. But when you talk about progressive alliance, would it be a progressive alliance with a Jeremy Corbyn-led Labour Party, given the concerns of Britain's 250,000 Jews, a huge number of whom, according to polls and according to their elected representatives and newspapers, and I like to say, they live in fear of Jeremy Corbyn being Prime Minister of this country, given their concerns about his support for people who are anti-Semitic and concerns over his own alleged anti-Semitism as well. Would that be really forming a progressive alliance?
Well, I think in fairness, the presence of the SNP in the alliance would make it more progressive than if we were not there. I mean, the Labour manifesto has got some good stuff in it, a lot of which has already been implemented in Scotland by the SNP, but it's sadly lacking in some other areas and could hardly be called radical. I mean, the commitment to renew nuclear weapons is one thing we'd want to talk about it, but so too would be electoral reform and abolition of the House of Lords and a whole range of other things about modernising how politics is done in this country.
Tommy Sheppard from the SNP, really appreciate your time. Thank you very much indeed. Now let's turn our attention back to the Conservatives after that big Conservative launch yesterday. Brandon Lewis joins us. He's Security Minister and Deputy for No Deal Brexit Planning, and of course a former Conservative Party Chairman as well. Good morning to you.
Good morning.
Good morning. A big launch yesterday. Boris Johnson speaking, waving around his manifesto. But a lot of people saying today it's a bit thin in terms of pledges, in terms of what you're willing to offer the British people. Other than get Brexit done, there's not very much there.
Unsurprisingly, Julie, I somewhat disagree with that. I think, look, first of all, I'm going to make no apologies for talking about getting Brexit done, because until the government gets Brexit done, actually can't really move on to anything else. And we've seen the Parliament's been unable to do that. That's why we need a Conservative majority. But in terms of the wider issues, look, we're talking about record investments in the NHS and delivering more GPs, more nurses as well. We're talking about bringing in an Australian points-based immigration system, increasing the threshold for national insurance, that's cutting taxes, and that'll be part of a tax cut for about 31 million people. We're looking at improving what we do on climate change, so getting to net zero by 2050. There's a whole range of things in there. I think it actually sets out a pretty exciting journey of travel for the next few years for a Conservative-led government, one that invests in our economy, invests in our public services, invests in infrastructure, and make sure that we end up as one of the more environmentally friendly countries in the world.
Been quite a lot of criticism, though, that many are saying that actually, even with the pledges you have got in terms of spending and investment, actually just not even taking us back to where we were in 2010 before austerity.
Well, I think I'd make 2 points on that. First of all, we make no apologies for the fact we had to do the right thing by the country back in 2010 itself. As we all remember, the note Labour left, there's no money left. They spent more than they actually were bringing in, and we had to fix that economic problem. I think sometimes, though it seems a long time ago, that economic situation was beyond disastrous. It was we were at a real precipice for our country, and we've turned that round. That means that we can now invest in things because we've got good economic stability there for our country. And our plans going forward are sensible plans that we can deliver, that invest in our public services, invest in infrastructure, and puts more money in people's pockets. It's not fantasy Christmas politics. It's not some make-believe, wish-we-could manifesto that we see from Labour. It's a properly thought-through manifesto that we can deliver with a Conservative majority.
Well, there's no doubt there's a lot of big spendings of 100 billion of infrastructure, of investment spending, but when it comes to current day-to-day expenditure, Labour Party are talking about an extra 83 plus billion pounds, although not even included the 58 billion we've just heard pension relief for women affected by the pension age rise. But you're looking at just 3 billion pounds. Is it fair to say this is a safety first manifesto? While Labour is the big giveaway, your promises, particularly regarding public sector and tax cuts is we won't take away. Theirs is a giveaway, yours is a takeaway. Is that though the sort of, I suppose, inspiring message that's going to get voters out?
Well, I think, again, I'd make a couple of points. At first, you're quite right. I mean, Labour's manifesto, the manifesto itself doesn't really include all the costs of the nationalisation, although I think if he gets a bit more desperate, he might try and nationalise Christmas before we finish this campaign. And yes, yesterday they suddenly go and run out with another thing of another 50-odd billion pounds. I mean, it's just fantasy land stuff. And even if they were anywhere near delivering it, all it's going to do is cost all of us more in taxes and raids on pensioners' pension funds, and certainly nationalisation would do that. What we're setting out is a properly costed thing that the country can afford, that we can deliver, and I would say is a very, very exciting agenda. You know, we want to increase our investment in the NHS. We want to make sure that our economy grows and we continue to see more jobs created, more job security, more money in people's pockets. And yes, I make no apologies. To do any of this, first of all, we've got to deliver on Brexit and get Brexit done, and that's why Prime Minister is absolutely right to say we will bring that before Christmas back into Parliament and get this done to it out of the EU by that January deadline.
Right now, let's try to get to the bottom of what is going on with this general election, all the different manifesto announcements, with somebody who can actually have a look at these things and check the actual facts, the full facts indeed. He is Chief Executive of Full Fact, Will Moy, who joins me now. Good morning.
Good morning. Thanks for having me.
Really nice to speak to you. We're big fans here on my Talk Radio Breakfast Show of talking to people who can offer us some... I mean, as such as anyone is completely independent or neutral, but someone who's not got a specific party political viewpoint. And we talked to Paul Johnson from the Institute for Fiscal Studies earlier to crunch some of those numbers on the manifesto. We've got all the manifestos out now. And we know that organisations like yours, you're not the only one. There are various different fact-checking organisations. Some of the big media companies have got them as well, trying to actually look at the facts. So when one person says, oh, this has done this, or this is the biggest number of houses built since why, that we need someone to say, is this true or isn't this true? So let's try and crunch some numbers from the Tory manifesto, because they are saying, and it very, very different sums from the Labour Party. Labour Party is committed to £83 billion of current expenditure. So not investment, not infrastructure, not building a new hospital, but actual increases in pay, extra money being spent in day-to-day spending. That's opposed to Tories only £3 billion, although that does come along after a load of big announcements of extra money in the last budget. The government says, the Tory government right now says, if they are elected December the 12th, there will be no rises in the rates of income tax, national insurance and VAT. Is it possible to continue to increase spending with what they've done on the budget and indeed that £3 billion without increasing those taxes?
Well, you mentioned the great Institute for Fiscal Studies, who are the experts in crunching tax numbers, and they seem to think it's a very, very tight equation. I think the big thing for us as voters is this promise of we're not going to change your VAT, we're not going to change or increase your national insurance, we're not going to increase your income tax. If they change taxes elsewhere, do you really care?
Yeah, this is the accusation we've had for years now about stealth taxes.
Exactly.
That you can have a headline figure that says this won't happen, but actually your taxes, when it comes down to you might not see it on your payslip, but when it comes to the end of the month, how much money you've actually still got in your pocket or in your bank account.
Exactly. So you don't have to tax somebody's income to tax them effectively. You don't even have to tax VAT. Labour have made a very similar promise. They're going to freeze the same free taxes except for the richest 5% of earners. But they've been very clear. They're also going to scrap the marriage allowance. They're going to make changes in corporation tax. So we know some of where for taxes they're going to rise.
And the marriage allowance, it's a basically you get a lower tax rate. You can transfer some of your tax bill, effectively your tax to your partner if you're married. And they've argued, Labour, look, that's because it just discriminates against people who aren't married. But nevertheless, this is only available to people up to an income of 50,000. So we're talking average and above average earners as well as below average earners. They will be hit by that. That will be a tax rise because you won't have that tax cut effectively.
Exactly. And Labour have been explicit about that to their credit. What we don't know with the Conservatives is if they can't make the sums add up over the next couple of years, if the economy doesn't go as well as they plan or whatever it might be, what would they do with taxes if they're going to freeze these
That's the key thing. But of course, we don't know really what's going to happen with the £83 billion of Labour's spending, because lots of this has gone back to two major parties and they're on what, who's likely to be in government. But the £83 billion, we're told constantly, you cannot fund that. All of the countries that do have a massively expanded public sector, Scandinavia, lots of Western European countries, the level of spending that the Labour Party are talking about is not off the scale in terms of public sector percentage of the economy compared to other countries. However, every single one of those countries has a much higher tax burden on ordinary people because basically there aren't that many very rich people and there are an awful lot of us average people.
That's right. It's worth remembering that the very rich people have a very large proportion of the total income and the total wealth in the country. So there are things you can do, but they have consequences. But you're quite
Partly
right.
also because some of them do have a habit of leaving the country if the taxes go up
Exactly.
too
Some of
much.
these people are very mobile. They're attached to multinational companies, etc. Taxes change behaviour.
Yeah.
So you can't just expect people to stay still when you raise taxes necessarily. And Labour have tried to factor that in their spending dog. But you're right to say that the analysts who've studied this, like the Institute for Fiscal Studies, have said they don't think that you can raise that amount of money without putting taxes up more generally across the population.
And then some of the specific announcements from the Tories were their headline figures. They've been talking a lot about the NHS, 50,000 more nurses in the NHS. And it's already been explained that 18,500 of those are nurses who they want to retain rather than new nurses.
Exactly. That was the news overnight. So this whole pledge has got us pretty puzzled, and the Conservatives have promised to try to explain it to us this morning. So if we get a decent explanation, it will go up on fullfactor.org and we'll come back and explain it. But firstly, they're saying we can have 50,000 more nurses for about £900 million. Now, £900 million is admittedly a lot of money, but it's not what 50,000 nurses cost. Roughly speaking, a band 5 nurse who would earn about £24,000 a year, once you factor in national insurance and
Holiday
pensions
pay,
and all the other things that it actually costs to employ something, roughly speaking, they'd cost about £53,000 a year for the NHS to actually employ. Multiply that out, and it costs about 2.8 billion pounds, depending on what you include, to employ 50,000 nurses. So we don't understand at the moment how the Conservatives think they're going to do this for 900 million pounds, and we don't understand whether these are actually, words of the manifesto are 50,000 more nurses.
Yeah.
Well, firstly, as you said, some of these are. They're trying to improve retention.
Well,
so
I suppose their
presumably
argument would
already
be,
working for the
they're saying
NHS.
yes, largely women, some men already working, but who would otherwise be expected to leave if they didn't get extra pay.
Sure, but what do you think of when you hear the phrase more nurses? But the other thing is there's about 40,000 vacancies for nurses in the NHS at the moment, some of them filled with temporary staff. So the other thing we want to know from the Conservatives is, are you just saying we're going to fill mostly vacancies that already exist, maybe change some of these temporary staff
So there'll
to
be the
permanent
same
staff?
number of people on the wards as there currently are, they'll be on staff rather than temporary.
This is what we don't know. The promise sounds great, but what's underneath it is at the moment a bit of a mystery.
And that does matter when it comes down to something like the NHS, because it does matter in terms of your actual ability, the treatment you get. And
if you turn up on a ward and you don't have a nurse or you don't have enough nurses, you feel it.
And in terms of some of those other pledges from the Conservative Party, what else have you been investigating and looking at?
The increasing number of police officers. Conservative Party are very clear. Part of it's Brexit and part of it is what they call your priorities, schools, hospitals, police. They've talked about increasing the number of police by 20,000 more officers on the street. The important context for this is that between 2010 and 2019, the number of police officers in England and Wales fell by 20,752. In other words, for every 7 police officers we had 10 years ago, we now have 6.
Yeah.
And if you factor in the fact that there are more of us in the country now, the number of police officers per head has actually fallen by a fifth in that time. So basically, recruiting another 20,000 police officers is going to put us back to where we were and leave the number of police officers per head actually slightly lower than where we were.
And a lot of the pledges we've seen from the Tory party are very similar to that. So sort of ending austerity, but going back to where we were back in 2010. In terms of the Labour Party pledges, I mean, they are huge big giveaways. The most recent being the one that's not even in the manifesto, which this £58 billion pledge to help the WASPy women against the state pension inequality. And I mean, that's a story that's been around for quite a long time. I remember writing about that about 4 years ago. These women, basically, the pension age went up. A lot of women just simply weren't informed. Look, people like me were aware that pension age had gone up, that they'd been equalised from 60 to 65 along with men, and then was going up another year. But an awful lot of people who don't follow this stuff because they've got lives were not aware. I went to retire on their 60th birthdays and discovered, no, I'm going to have to work for another 5 years, or we're going to stay on working age benefits and therefore losing out because the pension is higher. Have any of those numbers been costed to pay for that?
Well, they weren't in the manifesto. So in Labour's manifesto, they released a document. They said this is exactly how much more we want to spend. And they released another document next to it, which said this is exactly how we're going to raise it. They call it funding real change. Other people call it the Grey Book. The WASPy announcement came the next morning, is a very significant financial commitment. We still need to understand fully what the details are of that and what consequences does it have for having to raise money.
Yeah,
Labour's argument is that if the government lost a court case, it would just have to find money. So it's just going to find the money.
But we are talking about not 58 billion. It's such a huge sum. And in terms of the biggest question marks on any individual spending commitment that the Labour Party have got, what has been the one that's perhaps attracted the most interest for you guys?
Well, it's not actually the spending commitments that have attracted our attention. We all know the big arguments here are sort of Brexit and the NHS. They're the two things the parties would like to be talking about. Labour are they're giving warnings about the future of the NHS in a world where the Boris Johnson deal for Brexit goes ahead and we start trade negotiations with the US. And what they're saying is that the NHS could have to spend £500 million more every week on drugs. Mm-hmm. And this is, in our view, an unrealistic figure based on an extreme
This is the idea
scenario.
that we're going to do, the country's going to do a deal with Donald Trump, and we're basically going to sort of do a deal to pay huge sums extra to pharmaceutical companies in the United States to buy our drugs at a much higher rate than we buy them currently. Exactly.
And there's a reason for thinking that there's a real concern there. The real concern is that the US have published the negotiating objectives that say more access for their drugs companies into UK markets, for their pharmaceutical companies into UK markets.
We want more access for good drugs, don't we? So we can buy them?
Well, the NHS at the moment is a very, very powerful buyer because it's buying on behalf of everybody in the UK. It has a really strong power to dictate prices. So if you're in the US, a person typically pays 2.5 times as much for medical drugs as somebody in the UK does. Now, Labour's scenario is based on the idea that at the end of this trade deal, the UK would be paying 2.5 times as much for drugs. Yeah. If you look at what's happened in Australia that recently did a trade deal with the US, that's not what's happened.
Okay, so you think that is not true, simply not true.
There's a real concern. It deserves scrutiny, but those numbers are unrealistic.